And here we are with Melanie Phillips. Hello, Melanie.
Hello, Abby.
It is wonderful speaking with you again. Today, there is so much to talk about, so much going on, and especially so much information coming out of London. I'd love to hear your feedback on.
It's all happening in London.
It's all happening in London. So the first thing, let's go right into it. Speaker of the House of Commons. Speaker Berkow, what is going on there?
Many people are asking. The Speaker of the House of Commons is an ancient role whose function is to keep the House of Commons in order, to ensure the smooth running of business and keep MPs in order. And the point of the role is that the Speaker is apolitical. The Speaker is elected by the people, but is not elected as a member of a political party. So it's an absolutely apolitical role, and the essence of the Speaker's role is that the Speaker never expresses an opinion. Now, this current Speaker is called John Berkow, and he took it upon himself the other day to suddenly announce that President Trump, if and when he comes to Britain, will not be welcome to address both houses of Parliament, the House of Commons and the House of Lords, because he's racist and sexist. Now, this raised several eyebrows, to put it mildly, because first of all, no one has invited President Trump to address both houses of Parliament. President Trump is assumed to have no interest in speaking to both houses of Parliament. It is assumed that President Trump wants to ride in a golden carriage and have tea with Prince William and Princess Kate. Whether or not this is fair is neither here nor there. But the point is that nobody even asked President Trump to address both houses of Parliament. Secondly, Speaker Berkow has gone completely against this cardinal rule of the Speaker that he never expresses an opinion, and consequently has kind of besmirched the historic role of the Speaker. And thirdly, the idea that he wants President Trump barred because he's racist and sexist is quite extraordinary hypocrisy, because even President Trump's most bitter enemies in Britain, and believe me, there are more than a few, have to concede that London has played host to a whole succession of appalling tyrants and despots, blood-spattered men who have taken tea with the Queen and given every pomp and circumstance in their reception, because it's considered to be in Britain's interests to invite them on state visits and official visits and so on.
Isn't so the go-to place for like every rich prince throughout the Muslim world, regardless of what regime they're associated with?
Pretty well. So the idea that President Trump is kind of worse than all these people combined is obviously ridiculous. And finally, the idea that, you know, his crime is racism and sexism. I mean, quite put apart, leave aside, you know, his own behavior and whether he can be characterized as such. The idea that the House of Commons isn't stuffed full of racists and sexist men is completely ridiculous. So from every point of view, Speaker Berkow was, in my view, totally out of order. And this has, you know, ruffled a few feathers in London.
So where's that taking us? Because again, like you're saying, this is a historic break with the official role of what the Speaker is supposed to be about. So what's the fallout from this? What could possibly be?
Since it is the Speaker who imposes sanctions upon members of Parliament who step out of line, it's obviously for the Speaker to basically reprimand himself. I mean, it's something he really cannot do. But I mean, nothing will happen to the Speaker. I mean, you know, members of Parliament will take a very dim view. But it illustrates the kind of hysteria that there is about President Trump. I mean, whatever you think of him, and people are fully entitled to dislike him. I myself, I've often said, I've said to you on several occasions, I have serious reservations about his character and his temperament and whether that fits him for this great office that he now holds.
Right.
Nevertheless, the idea that he is simply the worst person in the entire world is completely over the top. a completely disproportionate reaction, and calls into question not President Trump's own character and behavior, but the attitudes of the people who hold this view, because it's a kind of hysteria that has taken hold of really quite sensible people. I was on a radio show. I do a radio show called The Moral Maze on BBC Radio. And last week we were touching on these issues. And some of my colleagues were intemperately expressing the view that in terms, he was simply the worst leader in the world, the most evil, the most appalling, the most disreputable leader in the world. When you consider all the terrible people who are leaders in the world, by any standards, this is just ridiculous. So you have to ask yourself, you know, what has taken hold of people that they behave in this way? And of course, in America, the reaction is commensurate. I mean, among the American media, the reaction to President Trump's every word and deed goes far beyond any reasonable criticism. Completely destroys the notion of journalistic objectivity.
Right.
But in terms of what's actually being said, it's just off the wall. And I find that really quite frightening. I found it frightening from the start, this irrational behavior,
Right.
which seems to, it really does seem to defy reason. And that's what I find frightening. People are kind of putting themselves beyond reason, beyond evidence, beyond appropriate behavior. I find that alarming.
It's interesting because I'm going to take your line of thinking and just go on a tangent here, because I'm going to go on the racism line for a second. I've just seen recently about whether a decision was made or funding was made or a direction that Trump has said that African Americans are very happy with. He is about to start funding or support programs for Black colleges and universities. I don't know, again, I'm not as familiar with this topic, but supposedly there are some colleges that have special programs for the African American community in America. And in this one decision he just did recently, he basically has done more for these African American colleges and therefore the African American community than President Obama did in 8 years in office, where everyone thought he was going to be the messiah to help the African American community. And I was one before the elections who said he's going to surprise people. He's going to do more for the minorities than Obama or the Democrats ever did, because the Democrats like keeping the minorities down and giving them free handouts, and he wants to help them so they can actually get a step up in society. So it's very sad that dealing with Trump, the facts are not taken into consideration, and it's all the ideological agenda and the hysteria like you're talking about. That's crazy. All right, well, I want to go to another issue taking place in London. You're just so full of news this week. We have the whole, we're still dealing with the fallout of the fake Muslim ban from the executive order of President Trump, which is not a Muslim ban. It's only 7 countries out of 56 Muslim countries. And one of the pushbacks has been the hypocrisy, because for decades there is a ban of Jews and Israelis from 16 Muslim countries, and the world has been absolutely silent. That issue has never been brought up. And all of a sudden, as a pushback to this whole fake Muslim ban, Theresa May, your prime minister, brought it up and actually called out Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party. When are you going to join me in calling out the, and again, maybe you have the exact quote, but when are you, Jeremy Corbyn, going to join me in calling out the hypocrisy and anti-Semitism in this 16 Muslim countries? Fascinating. What have you heard about that in London?
Well, indeed, she stood up in Parliament. So there was an exchange at Prime Minister's questions. I think Jeremy Corbyn raised the Trump ban in some way. And now it's very unusual for a Prime Minister to go out of her way to bring Israel into a conversation in a way that is favorable to Israel, because she didn't have to mention Israel at all. She could simply have replied on the basis of what President Trump had or hadn't done. But she chose to involve Israel. And the point she was making was she was drawing attention to Jeremy Corbyn's attitude to Israel. Jeremy Corbyn has, he's a far-left Labour Party leader. He has a history of supporting Palestinian Arab terrorism. I'll rephrase that. He doesn't have a history of supporting the terrorism. He has a history of supporting the terrorists. He is sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, to put it mildly, and he has appeared on platforms with people who not only represent that cause, but who are extremists and who have unsavory associations with terrorism. And he's never disavowed that. And this has caused a great deal of concern within the Labour Party, even among people whose own attitude to Israel is unfriendly. So he's deeply controversial, and Mrs. May is playing politics. She knows that, and she wants to draw attention to this fact. And so, she was playing politics, but even so, she asked a question which was, well disposed towards Israel and Israelis and Jews by pointing out the fact that these Muslim countries discriminate against Israelis, and inviting Jeremy Corbyn to denounce them.
Right.
And he refused to do so. What he said was, I'm not sure what he said, but the Labour leader's team, I'm just reading this, said, Jeremy opposes all immigration bans based on religion, ethnicity, or country of origin. In relation to the Israel-Palestine conflict, he supports a negotiated settlement based on UN resolutions to bring an end to and resolve all aspects of the conflict.
Oh, so he's basically trying to say that the ban, and it's not just Israelis, it's Jews. Jews are not allowed in most of these countries.
Precisely.
That it has to do with the political conflict between Israel and the people who call themselves Palestinians. It's not a human rights issue, but that's crazy.
Well, in fact, to be fair to him, Mrs. May said that Parliament should be aware of the discrimination and the ban that exists around the world, particularly for those who are Israeli citizens. So she kind of slightly muddied the waters. The particular sting, as you say, that is against Jews was lost even in what she said. And so he was able just to fixate on the Israeli bit. But nevertheless, it was a telling exchange. He slid away from it. He issued a blanket sort of, I support motherhood and apple pie statement.
Right.
And then, put the sort of little knife into Israel. And her point was made. Her point was made that he will not denounce this.
Right. And the fact again that you mentioned that she brought up Israel in this context and this hypocrisy using Israel was itself eye-opening, because she did not have to go in that direction, and yet she did.
Yes, there is no doubt that Mrs. May is an unusual British politician, an unusual British Prime Minister, in that she is genuinely, I believe, warmly disposed towards Israel and warmly disposed towards the Jewish people. Now, that's not to say that there aren't still significant differences between herself and the Israeli government. And indeed, British policy, it still holds that the Israeli settlements are illegal. It still holds to its desire to, its belief that there could be a Palestine state, that Israel is basically holding it up, that if there was a Palestine state, everything would be fine.
Right, sure.
And so it hasn't changed its overall policy, but Mrs. May has changed the tone in which Britain is regarding Israel.
Right, and that's wonderful. And that perfect segue to the recent meeting in London, 10 Downing Street, between Theresa May and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, dealing with the relations of the two countries. I think their first meeting since she's become Prime Minister.
Yes, and that also was interesting, that, Prime Minister Netanyahu came to Britain really quite early in Mrs. May's tenure. I mean, she's been Prime Minister just for a few months. And I would imagine, I mean, I wasn't a fly on the wall, but I would imagine that, the meeting was more than cordial, because Mr. Netanyahu will have found, a very supportive Prime Minister. However, he apparently came in order to try and change Britain's view towards the Iran agreement, and he went away with a flea in his ear, as I read it, in that Mrs. May stuck firm to Britain's support for that Iran deal. Mm-hmm. Now, Britain was very, it was thought at the time that Britain just went along in the way that Britain does with American foreign policy, that Britain was simply going along with the Obama administration's very keen desire that that deal should be made with Iran. I believe that it was more than that. I believe that Britain was a most enthusiastic supporter of the Iran deal, for reasons of, pragmatic realpolitik, that Britain thinks, or thought and still thinks, that this was the best deal that could be done in order to contain the threat from Iran. That Britain really thinks, or thought and thinks, that it has basically taken the sting out of the Iranian nuclear program. It's given the world, a 10-year breathing space, that it's a deal that can be and should be policed, that it will keep Iran in check, that it puts off the dread day when Iran will get a bomb, and it means that Iran will never get a bomb. Now, all those things don't hang together.
Right.
As I saw it, the deal actually departed from what was originally the core principle, that Iran must never, ever, ever be allowed to get the bomb, to make the bomb. And that kind of segued into, well, it won't be able to make it for 10 years.
Right.
To which my point was, so you're allowing Iran to make the bomb. To which the British response was, no, we're not. We've stopped it. Well, none of that to me made any sense. So this is where Mr. Netanyahu is coming from. He now has in President Trump a president who actually thinks the Iran deal was a terrible deal.
Right.
And at the very least, he wants to police it much more vigorously, to impose sanctions upon Iran, which I think he's already done, and maybe even tear it up. So Netanyahu wanted Mrs. May to join in and to start saying that, to be much tougher, to say that that Britain would impose sanctions, and she said no. She said no. Britain isn't going there, and this is going to be a point of difference between Britain and America. And
right.
That Britain, if Mr. Trump continues down this road of policing the agreement so that sanctions are imposed, etc., what's Britain going to do? Is
right.
Britain going to follow America as it generally does, or is it going to stand up and say, actually, we think this Iran deal is really a fantastic deal, and we are going to stick by it? We don't know. We don't know. It's a work in progress. So for the moment, Mr. Netanyahu has been sent away with nothing. But who knows what's actually going on behind the scenes in terms of Britain's thinking.
Right. I mean, I know from the headlines that Prime Minister Netanyahu was giving before his takeoff, he was basically saying, I'm going to meet Prime Minister May in order to set up an alignment between Israel, America, and Britain.
Yes.
Understanding that it's international agreement, so no matter how much Trump wants to rip it up, he can't rip it up, but to hopefully allow him, having England on board, to make whatever changes necessary as strict as possible to better enforce, better ensure that Iran is held its feet to the fire, so to say. Because so far, just the past 2 weeks, Iran has abrogated the deal a countless number of times.
Well, I'm just looking at a report in one of the British newspapers that says that she defended the nuclear agreement in the meeting, and the Downing Street spokesman argued that the deal was keeping Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon without resorting to war. The Prime Minister was clear that the nuclear deal is vital and must be enforced and policed, while recognizing concerns about Iran's pattern of destabilizing activity in the region. To put it mildly, you might say, destabilizing activity in the region. I mean, the Prime Minister has said the nuclear deal is vital, okay, and must be properly enforced and policed. Now, that leaves some leeway for a more aggressive stance in holding Iran's feet to the fire, in properly calling it to account for any backsliding over the deal, and then imposing a punishment, then imposing sanctions.
Right.
It leaves the way open for Britain to do that. So again, as in so many of these things, the signals are ambiguous. It may be that Mrs. May understands the point and agrees with it, but that she doesn't feel that in the circumstances she can just renege on the deal herself. She can just stand up and tear up British policy.
Right.
That it has to be a more subtle and general, a more subtle movement in that
right.
direction. Or I don't know, maybe she thinks this, she really does think this is a terrific deal, and that, you know, it avoids war, and that she's got to stick to it. We don't know.
Right. Wow. All right. Yeah. Well, we're still going to see. I mean, because even from the Trump presidency, he has given warning to Iran, and but we have no clue what he's planning to do or what he's already doing. Because one thing different from Trump than Obama, and he's been pretty clear about this. He said straight out, "I'm not going to tell the enemy what I'm going to do." Whereas Obama was the one saying, "Oh, we're going to attack on this date at this place." So totally different tactic. So. But we're going to have to wait and see on that one and keep on hearing. But in terms of Britain and Iran, you just wrote an article recently, and if I think you titled it "British Arms Sales Keeping Iran's Plot." And please expand on what that is about.
Yes, this was my weekly column for the Times of London, which appears on Tuesdays. And in that, I wrote about the controversy that's developed here over British arms sales to Iran, to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, as you know, is fighting in Yemen against the Houthis. The Houthis are backed by Iran. Saudi Arabia is consumed by anxiety that Iran has designs on the entire region, to rule the entire region, to establish its Shia crescent. Sunni Saudi Arabia can't have that. So it's fighting the Houthis in Yemen, and Britain has equipped Saudi Arabia with arms. And Britain's Foreign Secretary said at the time that this war in Yemen started, I think in 2015, that Britain would do everything in its power to help Saudi Arabia in fighting the Houthis in Yemen, other than actually putting British troops on the ground in combat. And that was because Britain understands, notwithstanding its appalling support for this dreadful nuclear deal with Iran, it understands that Iran is a threat not just to the region, not just to Saudi Arabia, not just to the region, but to Britain and the West, because if Iran establishes itself as a great power, then its ability to strike the West is greatly enhanced, and it's already at war with the West, etc. So that's why Britain has armed Saudi Arabia. Now, this is very controversial, because there have been numerous reports of indiscriminate civilian killings by the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen, and the British don't like that. This is one of the reasons why they are so hostile to Israel, because they believe that Israel was involved in indiscriminate civilian killing in Gaza. Now, it's quite a similar situation, because one also reads that there's a lot of evidence that the Houthis, that there is a lot of civilian killings going on in Yemen, but that is because the Houthis are using the Yemeni civilians, unfortunately, as human shields.
Right.
Are deliberately citing their military equipment and their military personnel in built-up areas where there are lots of civilians, for two reasons. One, to deter the Saudi-led coalition from attacking them, and two, cynically, to expose the civilians to almost certain widespread death and destruction in order to produce international condemnation, such as to put pressure on the Saudi coalition to withdraw from the attack. And this is precisely what's happened in Britain. A great deal of unrest, a great deal of concern. The NGOs, who of course are in such on such display when it comes to Israel's behavior in
right.
By adopting uncritically the Arab accusations, false accusations of widespread civilian killing, ignoring the use by civilians, use of civilians as human shields. Done the same thing again. These great NGOs have come forward and said, you know, there's indiscriminate killing, there is tremendous suffering. Undoubtedly, there is tremendous suffering. Undoubtedly, there are a lot of civilians being killed,
right.
But making no mention of being used as human shields. And this has come before a parliamentary committee, which has expressed concern, although the parliamentary committee expressing concern and saying it didn't necessarily believe Saudi protestations, that Saudi Arabia would itself ensure that there were no abuses and would investigate any allegations of abuses. The parliamentary committee said, well, we don't necessarily believe them. We would like a UN committee to investigate potential war crimes committed by all parties to the conflict.
Yeah.
So the parliamentary committee understands at least that, you know, there is a question mark about the use of human shields. So my piece was about that, and about the fact that, you know, it does pose horrendous problems when you have a regime like Saudi Arabia and you arm it. You know, is it ever right to arm tyrannies and despotisms in the world? And even more sharply, when it comes to Saudi Arabia, is it right to arm Saudi Arabia when Saudi Arabia is itself an enemy of the West? You know, here you have, it's such a confusing situation.
Yep.
Here you have Saudi Arabia, which is fighting on behalf of the West, or in the West's interests, against effectively Iran in Yemen. This is the same Saudi Arabia which, for decades, as the fount of the foundational country, the foundational state for Islamic terrorism, for Islamic extremism. It's the place where Wahhabi Islam was born. It has exported what we now know of as Islamist extremism, Wahhabi extremism, Sunni Islamism. It's exported it to the West. It has funded, Saudi Arabia is funding and has funded education institutions in Britain and America, in higher education, in universities and elsewhere, which are designed to promulgate the reach of this appalling doctrine to the West's dreadful demerit. I mean, it's, you know, it's caused both terrorism and cultural infiltration of extremist Islamic ideas.
And it's been happening for decades. This isn't something new. They've been putting money into, I know, American universities and chairs and centers in all the major universities in America for decades.
Precisely. So here is Britain arming Saudi Arabia. So how can this be right? So I conclude in this piece I've written that, as we know, my enemy's enemy may be my friend.
Right.
But it's also the case that my enemy's enemy may be my enemy.
Correct.
And then it's also the case that my enemy's enemy may still be my enemy, but at the same time, it may be my friend. So this is so confusing, and it produces so many moral conundrums that, you know, you can arm Saudi Arabia at the very to act in your interests as Great Britain, as the West, at the very same time that you are trying to stop Saudi Arabia from continuing to hurt Western interests.
Right.
What does a responsible government do in these circumstances? And Saudi Arabia is not alone in this. I mean, you think of Pakistan.
Right.
You know, Pakistan simultaneously crucial to the West's defense, and crucial to the fight to the attack also against the West.
Right.
Simultaneously.
Right.
These things are very difficult to pick through.
Right. Whereas at first we went into Pakistan, I'm thinking Afghanistan in terms of fighting that as well, fighting the Taliban, and now we partnered with the Taliban to fight even more extremists. It's just it's just crazy. It's just crazy. Exactly. Wow. All right. Well, that's your article on. They can get the snippet on MelaniePhillips.com or the Times for the full article. Melanie, always a pleasure speaking to you. Do you have a last comment to say after all this? So much information.
In Britain, journalists are going around holding their head saying, please, anything but Trump, anything but Brexit. And you know what? All we ever talk about is Trump and Brexit.
Well, I'm gonna put in the Israel angle for a second, and we were ending up talking about the mess. The Middle East, and I'm referring right now to the Muslim Arab Middle East, is a mess. The Sunni Shiite conflict. Those who are not Sunnis and Shiites are being murdered. Also, the one oasis in the Middle East is Israel. We have our issues too. Nothing's perfect, but obviously the attention the world focuses on Israel as opposed to focusing on the true mess in the Middle East. And if they look at us as the ally in helping them straighten out the Middle East, I think the world will be a better place. And definitely your information out there is helping get the truth out there.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, it's a testimony to the extreme excitements of the age, and the bizarre and not just bizarre, but the extraordinary developments in both Britain and America and in Europe who are being, roiled by uprisings of the people and so on. It's a testimony to the strange times that we're living in, that Israel suddenly becomes a beacon of tranquility, an oasis of sanity,
Right.
Something which otherwise one would find quite hard to sustain.
Right, definitely. We're living in interesting times, Melanie. Totally interesting. Well, thank you so much, Melanie. A pleasure speaking to you. Keep on writing all that information out there to get the truth out there. Anyone who you're not yet on Melanie's newsletter, go to melaniephillips.com. Check out her writings. Sign up for the newsletter. Melanie, have a wonderful, wonderful day, and thanks for your time.
Thanks, Abby. Always good to talk to you.
Bye.
Bye.